When Yakov Smirnoff immigrated to the United States from Russia, he is a comedian, some of you may know it, he related in one of his stand-ups, he talked about the first time he went into an American grocery store, and he said he was absolutely stunned and amazed by all the instant foods. He said he walked down the aisle and there was something that said, instant milk, just add water. And he went around the corner and it said, instant orange juice. Or powdered orange juice. That's what powdered milk, powdered orange juice, just add water. And then he said, I went around the last corner and it said baby powder. And I thought, wow, what a great country this is. It's silly. But I use that story as an illustration because I think it tells us how we, in our day and age, think. Quick, easy, fast. Give me the prescription. Let me just add water and go on. And we do this with pretty much everything, even our faith. Just give it to me and I'll move on. And yet we forget that anything we have now has a history. It has something behind it. It didn't just happen. And it may be replaced, but it didn't just happen. Somebody struggled and strained either with chemicals or with thinking to develop what we often take for granted. And yet, in our culture, we kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater a lot of times because we're so concerned with moving on that we forget that all that's invested in what is, including us. We are the product of our past. What we have taken and what we have discarded. What has been useful and what we have discovered to not be. I think this is one of the reasons why we have trouble dealing with cultures in the Middle East. When Jeannie and I were in Egypt right after the revolution, they were very concerned, very interested in democracy. They wanted to be democratic and think about it. And yet, as we pursued it, a lot of our thinking really didn't match their thinking. And finally, he looked at me, our guide, our companion, looked at me and said, how old is America? And I said, well, 250 years or so. And he says, wow, that's modern history. Did you get it? The culture goes back much farther. The tradition, the teachings, all that stuff goes way, way, way back, much farther than us. And then we wonder, when we go into a country that has lived with pharaohs for millennium, why they don't adopt democracy overnight. We forget how many people lived and died and how many wars were fought in Western civilization until we got to where we are. Do you understand? There's a lot that goes into this point in time of wrestling, thinking, living, dying, accepting, giving up, changing, empowering. If you were present last Sunday, you may recall how I said the cross we associate with the faith, this Latin cross often, was not adopted by the Christian church until the 6th century. 600 years after Jesus died. Yes, in 325 post-Constantine, there was a Constantinian cross, but it looked different. It looked different. Because it was hard in the ancient world. This cross that we so easily take for granted and kind of shallowly often think about, in the early church was an oxymoron. It was counterintuitive. It didn't make sense. It went against the grain of everything they had been taught about divinities. After all, if your God is the God or the greatest of gods, how in the world can you say that God suffers and even dies? It's counterintuitive. And it was counterintuitive not only to Jews, but to Gentiles, because it goes completely, it swims upstream. It goes completely against the grain. And so the church had to wrestle with this and figure out what does it mean and how do we interpret it, not only then, but for today. What significance does it have and what power does it give? I mean, think about it. If some group of people today, there was someone who was a traitor to the United States, was convicted and executed, and this little group of people said, oh, but you missed the boat. This person is really the Messiah. How would society react in general? You know, just because we say someone is a martyr today, usually back then, they were not necessarily seen that way, except for a small group of folk. And so Christianity had that same push, pull, growth, mature, explain, understand, reinterpret, and reclaim, as it not only grew itself, but began to speak to different societies and different nations and different cultures and different backgrounds. Are you following me? We think it should be instant faith, just add water. But it never was, and it never should be. Which means, as we come back to our text, that I think there is a whole lot more going on here than we often give credit. Because Jesus, at least in my mind, Jesus is not only asking his disciples then, but Mark, through these words, is asking the church of his time, and through me, I guess, today as we read the Scripture, asking us as the church in this time, who do people say I am? It's not a history question or a history lesson. It is a relevant contemporary one. And Peter responds, well, you are the Christ. He likes that. Until Jesus explains what being the Christ to him means. And then Peter falls victim not only to himself, Peter falls victim to what he has been taught his whole life. Do you understand me? Peter's reaction is not just Peter's, it's what he's been taught by the faithful his whole life. Jesus is calling into question his whole theology. He says, I'm the Christ, and I'm going to die. And Peter says, no, that's not the way it works, Jesus. Let me straighten you out. That will never, ever happen. And in a flash, Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. You don't get it yet. Peter's got more push-pull, stress-strain, things he's got to give up to take a hold of things new. There are things that need to get on that cross and die that life might come. Do you see? There is a push-pull. There is a challenge in our thinking. There should be a challenge in our faith and its maturity and in its growing. If you have a faith that you got in kindergarten, it's not going to work in an adult world. You know, you don't shut off the machines on someone you love when you're in kindergarten. And yet, as adults, we face those kind of issues, and if it's a living faith, it has to have some value and ethical meaning within that. It's got to grow, lest it becomes irrelevant. And that is what has kept Christianity alive, is that Christianity, for the most part, is not sought to kind of freeze time, but reinterpret the gospel in every age and every culture. You know, I was a number of years ago, I was in the Willow Creek Church in Chicago, one of the largest megachurches in the United States, one of the fastest growing in the 80s and 90s. Their target was baby boomers at that time. And if you went into the church, which was massive, looked like an auditorium really, if you went anywhere in the church, there were no crosses. None. Zero. None. And if you asked Bill Hybels, who was the lead minister of the church and still is, why that is, he said, well, we discovered among most people the cross got in the way. Now, that's a quote. Because they had so much bad baggage, what the church had taught them about that they saw no redeeming value in it. It was something they feared rather than accepted. It didn't change. It had never been reclaimed. It had no significance. What have we done to people? There are a few things, if that's the case, that need to be nailed on that cross that they die, that we can reclaim it in a new way. You follow me? The church has done damage to people. We have done damage to people, and we need to give them life. I met a young couple recently who were exploring, as many young couples do, a return to the church, Christianity, triggered by the raising of their child. And they wanted to sit down and talk about this church and what faith meant and unload some of their baggage of what they had had. And, when you really say, why did they leave the church? They really expressed what surveys tell us most young people these days say about the institutional church. Too narrow, unrealistic, biased, not very discerning, in some cases prejudiced. And they say that because their world is different. Their world is different. They grew up in a different time, in a different age. They're asking different questions. They've been exposed to ways of thinking and acting in society and culture like no generation before. And they no longer want to be insulted with simple pap answers or ambivalent doctrines. They don't want a church or a place where they have to be afraid to ask questions and express doubts. They want a personal but purposeful faith. It is Mike Slaughter, the lead minister of the Ginghamsburg Methodist Church. It too is a megachurch that is really shifting all their gears. It's very interesting how he writes in his church that serves, 15,000 a week. They only have, by the way, 1,200 members. They worship 15,000. You know why that is? Because joining the church isn't simple. You can worship there, but to be a part of the church requires a very deep commitment. Anyway, he says, this is a spiritual age in which people are looking for an experience of God, not an explanation. We often think life could be so much easier if only we received clear and immediate answers. But Jesus understood that real growth happens when we struggle with the significant questions. We struggle with the significant questions, and he goes on to say the church needs to provide that emotional space without judgment where people can ask the hard questions, believing that God is big enough to field them all. Hence the challenge, hence the struggle, hence true growth, hence a living faith. There's a book called Necessary Losses. I love that title. Necessary Losses, that as we mature, there are certain things you have to let go of to grow up. And I think that applies to our faith as well. Which is what the Apostle Paul said so eloquently. And we all know these words in 1 Corinthians. When I was a child, I thought like a child. I acted like a child. But when I grew up, I put away childish things. People often ask me if I use old sermons. I don't know, do they sound old? Do you reuse them? There's this barrel. Ministers say, well, go to the barrel, because that's code for, I'm too busy this week to write anything. I'll dig something good up. I preached a real good sermon. I preached a good sermon the Sunday after the Challenger exploded. I preached a good sermon the Wednesday night at a special service after 9/11. None of those sermons would be as good today. You follow me? They all had truth. They all had power. They all met the needs of the people at that time. There was living truth in them that helped people to reclaim their faith and move on as the world changed. If I preached them today, they'd be flat. Friends, ours is a living faith. It is a living faith. That's why it survived. Because it isn't trying to freeze us or to take us back. It is trying to breathe new life in every age, generation, culture. God is big enough to meet all the ethical and moral questions that we have and move us into a new time and application. Our world is different from that of the ancients. Our world is different from that of our great-grandparents. Our world will be different for our grandchildren. It has been the challenge of believers over the centuries to do this, to reclaim the cross, reinterpret it, re-understand it in light of what we know now and didn't then. And it will be forever the challenge of Christians to come. It took time. It was hard for those first disciples and those early Christians to claim the cross. The idea of a suffering God required years for believers to not just own, but to raise up with confidence and with significance. What I say to you is it requires us to do the same, to think, to ask questions, to not look for quick fixes, to wrestle, to work out, to grow, to mature in our faith. And I, for one, am grateful that this is a church that works diligently to provide the kind of place and space for people to do precisely that. And in so doing, allow the cross to have and to make the kind of impact it deserves. Amen.